Soviet Union. The emergence of the USSR. The history of Russia in the period between 1922 and 1991 is actually the history of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the history of the Soviet Union. This alliance, founded on ideological grounds in December 1922 by the leaders of the Russian Communist Party, is often identified with the Russian Empire. At the time, the new nation included 4 constituent republics: the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, or the Russian SFSR, the Ukrainian SSR, the Belarusian SSR, and the Transcaucasian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, or the Transcaucasian SFSR. The Constitution, adopted in 1924, established a federal system of government based on Soviets set up in villages, factories and cities in larger areas. At the top of this pyramid of Soviets in each republic was the All-Union Congress of Soviets. Although Congress appeared to exercise sovereign power, this body was governed by the Communist Party, which was again controlled by the Politburo of the Central Committee of the CPSU from Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, as it was during the time of the emperors before Peter the Great. War, communism and the new economic policy. The period from the consolidation of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 to 1921 is known as the period of war communism. Land, industry, banks, railways and shipping were fully nationalized, and the economy was limited. A strong opposition soon developed. The peasants wanted to monetize their produce and were unhappy about having to hand over their surplus produce to the government. Faced with peasant opposition, Lenin began a strategic retreat from war communism known as the New Economic Policy, NEP. Peasants are exempt from taxes for selling goods in bulk and are allowed to sell surplus produce on the open market. The trade is encouraged by the private retail sales license. The state was still responsible for banking, transport and heavy industry. Although the leftists of the Communist Party criticized the rich peasants or kulaks who made large profits from the NEP, the program proved to be extremely beneficial and the economy was restored. The NEP would later develop a strong opposition within the party after Lenin's death in early 1924. Changes in Russian society. While the Russian economy was undergoing a process of transformation, people's social life also underwent drastic changes. Since the beginning of the revolution, the government has tried to weaken the patriarchal dominance of the family. Divorce no longer required court proceedings, and in order to free women from the responsibility of giving birth, abortion was legalized as early as 1920. As a consequence, the emancipation of women increased the demand for work. Girls were encouraged to get an education and build a career in a factory or office. State kindergartens were opened for the care of young children and great efforts were made to make the centers of social life educational and recreational groups, the so-called Soviet clubs. The regime abandoned the imperial policy of discrimination against national minorities in favor of a policy of incorporating more than 200 minority groups into the life of the Soviet Union. The regime also expanded the range of medical services. Campaigns against typhus, cholera and malaria were carried out, the number of doctors increased, and the infant mortality rate soon fell while life expectancy increased. The government also promoted atheism and materialism, which undermined Marxist theory. They opposed organized religion, especially in order to break the power of the Russian Orthodox Church, which was a pillar of the old Tsarist regime and the main obstacle to social change. Many religious leaders were sent to internal exile camps. Party members were forbidden to go to religious services. The education system is separate from the church. Religious education is prohibited except in home education, and schools emphasize atheism. Industrialization. The period from 1929 to 1939 is a turbulent time in Russian history. It was a period of mass industrialization and internal unrest when Joseph Stalin established almost total control over Russian society, as he wielded unlimited power that even the most ambitious of czars did not possess. After Lenin's death, Stalin fought for power over the Soviet Union with his rivals in the Politburo, especially Leon Trotsky. By 1928, when all the Trotskyists were either exiled or out of power, Stalin was ready to begin implementing a radical program of industrialization. Stalin proposed the first five-year plan in 1928. Excluding the NEP, New Economic Policy, devised by Lenin, this was the first of a number of plans to be implemented to rapidly accumulate capital through the construction of heavy industry, collectivization of agricultural production, and restrictive policies on commodity production. Consumer goods. For the first time in history, the economy of a country was completely controlled by the government. As part of the plan, the government took control of state agriculture and collective farms, kolkhozes. By a February decree of 1930, about 1 million kulaks were driven from their estates. Many peasants opposed the regime. Often, faced with losing their land, they killed there. In some areas they rebelled, but they are few in number. Peasants, called kulaks by the authorities, were executed. A combination of bad weather, deficits on forcibly established collective farms, and mass confiscation of goods led to a famine that killed several million peasants, mostly in Ukraine and Kuban. The poor conditions in the countryside led millions of desperate peasants to go to the cities, which contributed to the development of industrialization and greatly increased the Russian urban population in just a few years. The plan brought significant results in other domains as well, not only in agriculture. Russia, in many respects the poorest country in Europe at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, now industrialized at an incredible rate, surpassing German industrialization in the 19th century and Japan during the early 20th century. Soviet authorities claimed in 1932 that industrial output had increased by 334% during 1914. And in 1937 that during 1932 it was increased by an additional 180%. Moreover, Russia's survival in the face of the impending Nazi onslaught was made possible by the productive capacity that resulted from industrialization. While the 5-year plan was being implemented, Stalin was establishing his personal power. The NKVD secret police was assembled from tens of thousands of Soviet citizens to carry out arrests, deportations or executions. 6 Politburo members from 1920, who outlived Lenin, disappeared in Stalin's purges. Old Bolsheviks who were loyal comrades of Lenin. High officials of the Red Army and industrial directors were liquidated in large purges. Purges in other Soviet republics contributed to the centralization of power in the Soviet Union. Stalin's reprisals led to the creation of a system of internal exile, much larger than those created by the emperors in the past. Draconian punishments were introduced and many citizens were convicted of trumped-up crimes, sabotage and espionage. The work performed by convicts who worked in labor camps within the Gulag system became a significant component of industrialization performance, especially in Siberia. About 18 million people are thought to have gone through the Gulag system and another 15 million were sent to forced labor. The Soviet Union and international relations. The Soviet Union felt a great threat from the coming to power in Germany of anti-communist forces, led by Hitler. That threat became real when Hitler publicly proclaimed the Eastern Penetration Plan as one of the main goals of his Lebensraum strategy. By 1939, the Soviet Union was a significant opponent of Nazi Germany, supporting Republicans in Spain who were fighting German and Italian troops. During 1938 and 1939, the Soviet Union waged a highly successful war against Japan in the Russian Far East, which ended with the signing of a mutual non-aggression pact that remained in effect until August 1945. However, in 1938, Germany signed the Munich Agreement with the Western powers and, together with Poland, partitioned Czechoslovakia. Fearing a German attack, the Soviet government began diplomatic maneuvers, after Poland refused to participate in common security, and the Soviet Union concluded the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, a non-aggression pact with Germany. With this agreement, mutual relations between the two countries were normalized and their mutual trade continued. Second World War. 17 days after the start of the German invasion of Poland, when the German army was 150 kilometers from the Soviet border, the Soviet army occupied the eastern parts of Poland inhabited mainly by Ukrainians and Belarusians. After the failed negotiations regarding the exchange of territory, which was necessary for the Soviets to better defend Leningrad, the Soviet Union started a war with Finland, known as the Winter War, 1939–1940. They won that war with great losses, but they still forced Finland to sign a peace agreement, with which they received a part of the Karelian territory. In the summer of 1940, they forced Romania to hand over Bessarabia and northern Bukovina to them with an ultimatum. At the same time, they occupied the previously independent Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Both sides were preparing for war. Despite Stalin's efforts to avoid that war with Germany, she declared war on the Soviet Union and crossed the border on June 22, 1941. By the end of November, the German army occupied Ukraine, began the siege of Leningrad, and threatened to take the capital itself, Moscow. Despite the fact that the Soviet Union launched a successful counteroffensive in December 1941 that pushed the Germans back from Moscow. The Germans reorganized and during the following year directed the bulk of their forces to the southeast, with the aim of breaking out on the Volga and the Caucasus. The Soviet victories in the Battle of Stalingrad and Kursk proved decisive and changed the course of the entire war. After these defeats, Germany was unable to wage an offensive war, so the initiative passed to the side of the Soviet Union, which it would retain until the end of the war. By the end of 1943, the Red Army had broken the German siege of Leningrad, retaken much of Ukraine and western Russia, and crossed into Belarus. By the end of 1944, the front had shifted from the Soviet borders of 1939 to Eastern Europe. With significantly superior troops, Soviet forces entered East Germany and captured Berlin in May 1945. This ended the war against Germany in favor of the Soviet Union. As part of the agreement signed at Yalta, 3 months after Victory Day, Soviet troops successfully invaded Manchuria, ending their war. Although the Soviet Union emerged victorious from World War II, the economy was devastated, and 27 million Soviets died during the war. About 1,700 cities and about 70,000 settlements were destroyed. 13 million Soviet citizens were victims of the repressive policy of Germany and its allies in the occupied territory. Special German Einsatzkommando, Baltic and Ukrainian collaborators participated in the genocide of Soviet Jews. Romanian units participated in the genocide of Jews in the Odessa region. During the siege, Leningrad lost 27% of its population, and Pskov and Novgorod lost a fifth of their population. A large number of the Russian population in Karelia perished in Finnish concentration camps. The occupied territories suffered great devastation by Germany, deportation to labor camps, but the Russians also applied devastation tactics during their retreat. As a result, millions of people in the occupied territories died of hunger and lack of basic medical care. About 3.5 million Soviet prisoners of war, out of 5.5 million, died in German camps.
Cold War.
The cooperation of the Allies won the war and was supposed to be the basis of post-war reconstruction and security. However, the conflict between the Soviet Union and the USA, known as the Cold War, dominated the international scene in the post-war period as a clash of ideologies. The Cold War rose out of the conflict between Stalin and U.S. President Harry Truman over the future of Eastern Europe during the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945. During the previous 150 years, Russia had suffered 3 devastating attacks during the Napoleonic Wars and during the First and Second World Wars, so Stalin's the goal was to establish a buffer zone from the countries in between Germany and the Soviet Union. Truman accused Stalin of betraying the Yalta Agreement. As Eastern Europe was occupied by the Red Army, Stalin gained time as his atomic bomb project slowly and surely progressed. In April 1949, the U.S. sponsored the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a mutual defense pact that obliged most Western countries to treat an armed attack against one of them as an attack on all. The Soviet Union founded the Eastern equivalent of NATO in 1955, called the Warsaw Pact. The division of Europe into the Western and Soviet blocs later took on a global character, especially after 1949. When the U.S. nuclear monopoly ended with the testing of the Soviet RDS-1 bomb and the coming to power of the Communist Party of China in the People's Republic of China. The most important goals of Soviet foreign policy were to maintain and increase national security and maintain supremacy over Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union maintained its dominance in the Warsaw Pact by suppressing the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and supporting the suppression of the Solidarity movement in Poland in the early 1980s. The Soviet Union opposed the United States of America in numerous proxy wars around the world, the biggest of which were the Korean and Vietnam Wars. As the Soviet Union continued to maintain firm control over its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, the Cold War moved towards a partial de-escalation, and the situation became more complicated in the sense that there were no longer just 2 clearly separated opposing sides of the 1970s. The less powerful countries had more space to establish their independence, and the 2 superpowers were partly able to recognize a common interest in trying to control the further expansion and multiplication of nuclear weapons, with agreements such as SALT I, SALT II and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Russian-American relations deteriorated after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the 1980 U.S. presidential election that elected Ronald Reagan, a staunch anti-communist, but improved when the Soviet bloc began to disintegrate in the late 1980s. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia lost the superpower status it had gained in World War II. Khrushchev and Brezhnev. In the power struggle that followed Stalin's death in 1953, his closest followers lost. Nikita Khrushchev cemented his position with a speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1956 in which he exposed Stalin's atrocities and accused him of promoting a cult of personality. As parts of his speech became public, Khrushchev soon began implementing numerous reforms. Setting aside Stalin's emphasis on heavy industry, he increased the production of consumer goods and housing and encouraged agricultural production. The new policy improved the standard of living, although the problems of shortages of household appliances, clothing and the like worsened in the following years. The legal system, although still under the complete control of the Communist Party, replaced police terror and intellectuals had more freedom than before. Khrushchev was expelled from the Central Committee of the Communist Party in 1964, accused of being responsible for the Cuban Missile Crisis and deepening Sino-Soviet problems. After a brief period of joint leadership, veteran bureaucrat Leonid Brezhnev took Khrushchev's place. Despite Khrushchev's efforts at economic planning, the economic system remained dependent on central plans made without reference to the market mechanism. As a developed industrial country, the Soviet Union found it more and more difficult to maintain the high growth rates in the industrial sector that it had enjoyed in previous years. Increasing investment and increasing numbers of workers were required, but this was difficult to achieve. Partly because of the new emphasis on the production of consumer goods. Although the goals of the 5-year plans were smaller than those of the previous ones, the goals were largely unachieved. Agricultural development was still lagging behind in the years under Brezhnev. Although certain appliances and other goods became more affordable during the 1960s and 1970s, improvements in housing and nutrition were not enough. Consumer needs grew and, therefore, shortages in consumer goods inherent in the non-market price system, petty theft of state property and the growth of the black market. But, contrary to the revolutionary spirit that pervaded the birth of the Soviet Union, the prevailing mood at the time of Brezhnev's death in 1982 was a desire for change. During the years Khrushchev and Brezhnev were in power, science and industry flourished. The first nuclear power plant in the world was built and put into operation in 1954 near the town of Obninsk. The Baikal-Amur Highway, which connected the Russian Far East with the rest of the country, was completed. The Soviet space program, led by Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, was extremely successful. The first artificial satellite, Sputnik, was launched into space on October 4, 1957. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first man to travel into space, aboard the Soviet spaceship Vostok 1. Among the successes of the Soviet Union in the conquest of space are the recording of the first image of the dark side of the Moon, the sending of the first woman Valentina Tereshkova into space, the first stay of a man in open space by Alexei Leonov and the launch of the first space station, Salyut 1, which in 1986 was replaced by the Space Mir station. The collapse of the USSR. The introduction to the collapse of the Soviet Union was marked by two processes, the increasingly visible disintegration of the Soviet economic structure and attempts to stop further disintegration, all with the aim of returning to the previous state. After the rapid replacement of Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernyenko, two significant figures from the time of Brezhnev's rule, Mikhail Gorbachev made significant changes in the economy and party leadership. His policy of glasnost allowed the public to be informed freely after decades of repression by the government. It gave the media the opportunity to draw the public's attention to numerous social problems. During the wave of revolutions that began in 1989 and engulfed Central and Eastern Europe, the USSR lost almost all of its external allies. Glasnost allowed the national discontent that existed in other republics to bubble to the surface. The Baltic republics, Georgia and Moldova demanded greater autonomy, which Moscow did not agree with. Gorbachev failed to solve the most important problems. Fuel and natural gas shortages, the war in Afghanistan, outdated industry and systemic corruption were the biggest problems that the Soviet-planned economy could not overcome, so the government gave up on its further implementation. There were shortages of almost all products, so the population had to wait in lines for the most basic foodstuffs. Because of the dominant position of the Russians in the Soviet Union, almost no one made much of a distinction between Russia and the Soviet Union until the late 1980s. However, The fact that the Russians dominated the Soviet regime does not mean that the Russian Republic necessarily profited from this alliance. In the Soviet Union, Russia lacked even the most innocuous instruments of statehood, which other republics possessed, such as its own branch of the Communist Party, the KGB, the Trade Union Council, the Academy of Sciences, and similar institutions at the republic level. The reason for this was that if these organizations had branches in the Russian Republic, these branches would be in terms of power, competition with those institutions at the federal level. During the late 1980s, Gorbachev underestimated the importance of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Russian patriots began to point out that money is flowing from Russia to other republics, especially when it comes to oil. There were demands that Russia establish its own institutions. Those Russian demands became louder in the late 1980s, so there was tension between those who were in favor of Russian supremacy in the Soviet state, on the one hand, and those who were in favor of an independent Russia. These tensions intensified in the personal struggle for power between Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. This old party cadre, without any ties to dissident circles, pressured by Gorbachev's unionist policy, looked for an alternative political program in order to threaten Gorbachev. He began to present himself as a Russian nationalist and committed Democrat. He managed to win the election as chairman of the Russian Supreme Soviet in May 1990, which meant that Yeltsin became Russia's first directly elected president. The following month, Yeltsin gave Russian laws priority over Soviet laws and established control over two-thirds of the total budget. Soviet coup attempt and removal of Gorbachev, organized by members of the hardline communists, was stopped with Yeltsin's help. The putschists intended to preserve the party and the alliance, but they only hastened the end of both. The Soviet Union officially disintegrated on December 25, 1991. The final act of the transfer of power from the Soviet Union to Russia was Gorbachev's handing over briefcases to Yeltsin, which contained codes for launching Soviet nuclear weapons. The Russian Federation officially began to exist on December 26, 1991.